In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good gifts and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, tonight is Leviticus, the book that everyone who has ever thought, I'm going to do it. I'm going to read the Bible. I'm going to read it. I'm going to start in Genesis, and I'm going to make it all the way to the end. Leviticus is the book that beats them all. And everyone stops when they get into Leviticus because it is hard. It's a hard slog if you don't know how the book is put together. So my goal tonight is to show you how the book of Leviticus is put together, make it more accessible, make it something that you could at some point say, I am going to sit down and try Leviticus, and I'm going to try and get your head out of the weeds a little bit, see like what's going on in the book. I'm also going to try and go through the whole book. So we'll see what happens. If we remember the context of Leviticus, this is the book following immediately after Exodus. And Exodus was a story of Israel, which has been enslaved to the Egyptians, who are the Nephilim of this particular story, the demon worshippers. And they've been pulled out, and they've been taken out of Egypt in order to worship God. That's the express reason that is given. They get pulled out. They are purified through a series of actions, going through a baptism and a chrismation and a sitting at the feet of the apostles and an eating of the heavenly bread. They go through these things in a typological way. They're being brought into the body of Christ, and they're brought to the holy mountain. The goal being that they will ascend the mountain of the Lord and dwell in the heavenly tabernacle with him and have communion with him. And to be fair, some of them do. Moses and Aaron and the elders do go onto the mountain of the Lord. Moses the most. But even some of like the 70 elders and things go up there, and they do. They have a meal with God. They have this communion with God. And Moses ascends all the way to the top of the mountain, and he dwells with God in the heavenly tabernacle for like 40 days. And then it all falls apart at the bottom of the mountain, and they return to the pagan worship. Moses comes down, stuff happens, and they build an earthly tabernacle, which is a pitiful earthly substitute of the heavenly tabernacle that God agrees to dwell in a localized way, but he's only going to talk to Moses, and he's only going to interact with the priests, and only if they, all these conditions now put on Israel's ability to interact with God, and it's going to take some time to get them ready to dwell on the holy mountain with God. That's the context for Leviticus. Leviticus is all the rules about how close to God you can get at any given time, and who that is, and how to do it. It is the book of how not to die because of interacting with God. How not to cause a direct and immediate participation in the flood of Noah in your own life, where you die because of being exposed to the holiness of God. That's the context of Leviticus. Here's the structure of Leviticus. It starts with the sacrifices, and then it talks about the people who will do the sacrifices, and then it talks about what the people need to be like in order to do the sacrifice as well. That's the first half. Then you get the Day of Atonement, which is the highest feast. And that's all the edge. So you're doing the sacrifices for various reasons we'll get into. These are the people who are the closest to God, the priests who are doing the sacrifices, and they're the ones who are the closest to God in the temple. The uncleanness is all the levels of closeness and how to get in there. For the Day of Atonement, which is the closest anyone gets to God, that's when God actually dwells on earth with the people in his most manifest form. And then the back half of Leviticus is referred to now by scholars as the holiness code. And it's kind of like how to live the life of the fact that God dwells among the people in these kind of really specific ways. So all the steps of how to get really, really close. This is what really, really close looks like. And here's the consequences of being really, really close. And then the last chapter is like votive gifts. And no one knows what to do with the last chapter or why it's there and anything like that. I'm going to gloss over it and not talk about it at all because I have nothing to say about the redemption of votive gifts tacked on at the end of Leviticus. So let's jump in. Leviticus is structured even more so as a series of times that God speaks to Moses. Throughout Leviticus, you'll see the different sections are marked off with, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses saying," and then he does stuff like that. And I want to highlight that because you don't know Hebrew. There are different words for saying and speaking in Hebrew, and this is a specific one. This is the verb dabar. Dabar is the verb form of the word dabar, which means word. When you see the word of the Lord, that's davar Adonai, the word of the Lord. That's Jesus, just so we're all on the same page. So when you do the verb of that, it's like saying, and the Lord worded to Moses. Or in this sense, really, it's because it's, and the Lord dabared. So it's Adonai and the dabar. It's like, this is like saying the word of the Lord came to Moses saying, and the Lord worded at Moses saying da 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 da. This is Jesus coming to Moses over and over and being like, okay, so here's some more rules. So this is what you're going to have to do when something does this specific thing. This is how to like deal with that so that they can come back. That's what you're getting throughout all of Leviticus. It's multiple conversations that Moses is having with the Lord in the tabernacle. We're told in Exodus what this looks like, where Moses' face shines all the time, so he's got his veil on. Periodically, the cloud descends on the tabernacle. The Holy Spirit descends on the tabernacle and makes the third person of the Trinity descends on the tabernacle and makes the second person of the Trinity present in the tabernacle. And Moses walks in and he talks to him and has kind of like private one-on-ones with Jesus kind of regularly. And the book of Leviticus is what comes from that, more or less. Okay. Sacrifices. There are 5 sacrifices you need to care about. I'm going to list them quickly, then I'm going to describe each of them, and then I'm going to keep bringing them up over and over because they are the basis for all the other stuff in the book. So, first, here's what a sacrifice is. This is a ritual participation in the presence of God on Sinai. The way that they interacted with God on Sinai was a communal meal with God. Communion. The rituals are meals. You eat most of these. And this is a ritual participation in Sinai. This is some shadow of the goal. The goal is to one day have communion with God. And these are steps towards that. It is worth bringing up that, as I'm going to talk about all the sacrifices, these are all sacrifices eventually to make atonement. And atonement's a funky word. I'm going to gloss way over the word atonement. I'm going to let you know that the Hebrew word means cover. To cover up. To hide, conceal, or protect. That's what it means. We're going to gloss over where the word atonement in English comes from because it's back reading kind of forensic Protestant theology into the word kippur for atonement. I'm going to keep using the word atonement interchangeably with the word covering, just so everyone knows. Atonement is not the goal. That's also worth pointing out. Atonement is not the goal. When you get into the New Testament, atonement is not the goal of the Christian life. Atonement is the means to the goal. The goal is communion with God. Atonement is one of the steps on that process. It's a big one. It's a real big one, and we'll see why when we get into this. But just know that atonement is not the goal of Christianity. It is one of the main things of Christ's dispensation, Christ's condescension. Did the atonement stuff, but it did the atonement so that God became man. So that man could become God. And we'll talk about what that looks like as we continue on and on and on. But I feel like I need to make a big deal about atonement because of the state of people's biblical theology. All right. Cool. The offerings are described twice. First from the perspective of the people, then from the perspective of the priest. Basically, this is why we're doing this. And then from the other hand, it's like, okay, here's where you make the cut. And here's the ones you have to it's all the instructions. The back half, really hard to read. First half, awesome. Here's your 5. Rapid fire. You have, and these are going to be different words than sometimes you see them in translations. You have the ascension offering, the tribute offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. Typically, the ascension offering is going to be called a whole burnt offering, and the tribute offering is typically called a grain offering if you're reading like most translations. But the words in Hebrew are olah, which means go up, and mincha, which is a tribute. It's like a tax. Then you have the peace offering, the shalamim. You have the sin offering, the chatat, and the guilt offering, the asham. So here's what they each are. The ascension offering is the number one most important. If you don't remember any of the other offerings, remember the ascension offering. It is the olah. It is the point. It is going up to God. And throughout the offerings, another clarification I'll make. A lot of these offerings involve the priests and or the people putting their hands on the animal, and then it's offered. It is worth knowing that that is not the people putting their sins onto the animal. That's only one of them, and we'll talk about that later. Typically, that's actually just identification with the sacrifice. It has nothing to do with the transfer of sins, typically. That would be an issue if it did, because that's how you ordain priests, by putting your hands on them. It'd be weird if that always meant transferring sins. It'd be weird if the way you ordain priests was to transfer sins to them. It's worth knowing. Not in the text. Only on the Day of Atonement are we going to talk about transferring sins to animals. So, in the Ascension offering, you have laying your hands on the animal. The animal dies. It is divided up. It is washed. And then it is burned. And in the smoke, it goes up to the Lord. That's how the Ascension offering works. Lay on hands, and then die, divide, wash, burn. Here's what's going on with that. So the leaning on the animal, putting the hands on the animal, that's identification with the animal. Then the animal dies. This does have something to do with the fact that the penalty of sin is death. And so the offerer, in some sense, dies with the animal. Then the animal is divided, washed, and then reunited in the smoke. So once you've burned all the pieces, there's only one smoke. So division, purification, and then reunification and ascension up to God. We see in this is the whole point of Israel. This is Israel's history. They are identified. They pass through death and come out the other side. They are separated from the other nations. They are purified. And then there's a reuniting and an ascension up to God. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the plot of the Bible, is how that happens to humanity. They are identified, they die, they are divided, purified, and brought back together. That's what Pentecost is all. It's the bringing you back together. And then fire is really important at Pentecost. It's the oneness and the going up. This is ascending up to God. This is the whole, get back onto the mountain sacrifice. That's what this is for. It is a ritual participation in Moses ascending the mountain of God. In the text, it's also worth knowing that each of these are offered by things. I think it's worth just noting out that it says, in your translation, it'll be something like, when a man offers blah, 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 blah. The Hebrew there is Adam. When Adam offers the go up the mountain of the Lord sacrifice, here's how you do it. I think that wording is worth knowing. All right. So, sacrifice number 1, most important, ascension. Notice nothing is eaten. It all goes up to God. All right, tribute offering. I said this is mincha. This is like a tax. That's what that word kind of means. This is offered by a soul. That's the Hebrew word that's used, nefesh. When a soul offers blah, 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 I guarantee the average Bible translation translate that as man or something like that. The word is soul. One day I should do just a lesson on heart, soul, and mind, heart, soul, and strength from the Shema. I'll talk about. I guess one day I'll talk about that. All right. This is tribute to God, the King and Conqueror. This is showing that you belong to the people of God. You don't pay taxes to someone that's not in charge of your country. If you're not a member of the country, you don't pay taxes typically. So paying the tribute, doing the tribute offering, is a recognition of your citizenship in the people of God. That's what it represents. There are 3 parts to this: bread, incense, and oil. These also correspond to the maintenance of the tabernacle itself. This tribute offering can be thought of as the tithe. This is the tithe of Israel. You have the showbread in the temple, which is just bread that's baked, put in the temple, and it just sits on a table. And it just is the presence of God, bread in a temple. If that doesn't sound familiar, you should go to church more. The lamps, which are constantly burning before the Lord as a perpetual memorial and totally represent angels, oil. And then you have the altar of incense, and the incense is something that we will talk about as super duper important for purifying the temple, keeping the temple clean. These are the things that are in the tribute offering: bread, incense, and oil. After they take possession of the land, a 4th thing is added to the tribute offering: wine. So it becomes bread, wine, oil, and incense. And if that doesn't sound familiar, you should go to church more. It is worth knowing bread signifies beginning. Wine signifies consummation or completion. This is why in the Old Covenant, the priest did not drink the wine. In the New Covenant, they do. It is because the New Covenant has consummated the Old Covenant. And so before they get to the Holy Land, no wine is even offered. When they're in the Holy Land, wine is offered. It's not drunk by the priests. And then in the New Covenant, bread and wine are both offered, and they are consumed by the priests. It is also worth, I think this is a good thing that someone brought up, Eucharist. Because it is both bread and wine, commemorates both that Sunday is the first day and that it is the 8th day. And I will just let you ponder the meaning of Sunday being both the first day and the 8th day contained in the Eucharist for time reasons. All right. Salt is also part of this. When Jesus says you're the salt of the earth, there is some going back to the tribute offering. Yeah. This also remembers the Passover, when the spoils of Egypt were taken and given to God in tribute to build. The whole tabernacle is built out of all the stuff they stole from Egypt. minus the earrings, because that became the golden calf and then got put out of use for God. But yeah, so ascension offering is the going up to God. Tribute offering is the maintenance of the tabernacle and citizenship in the people of God. The peace offering. You eat this one. This is one that everyone eats. The tribute offering, the priests eat part of it. And the peace offering, everyone eats from this one. And this is your communal meal with the God. And each other, because everyone's eating of this sacrifice. This can be related back to, this is like a marriage feast. Why do we have a big feast at a marriage? It is because eating together is communion. It is putting people together. This is why eating meals together as a family is like so important. And when that goes away, you get a lot of more problems with family unity, a unity of any kind. Eating together is really, really important. It's one of the reasons why in the Orthodox Church, we're so keen to keep our agape feast after the Eucharist. It's not just that we eat the Eucharist all together, although that's clearly the high point of it. We also have the earthly meal all together every time, if we're able to. There's a reason for that. And it goes back to this peace offering. Often in the Old Testament, you'll see idolatry and adultery describe as back and forth as together. It's not just a cool pun in English. It has to do with this peace offering. It's communal meal with the demon. You're either marrying yourself to demons or you're marrying yourself to God. All right, ascension offering, tribute offering, peace offering. There's your three most important ones. Then you have the sin offering and the guilt offering. The sin offering is when you do something and you know it's bad. That's what the sin offering is for. It's when you commit a sin and you... So I should say, the first three are happening all the time. The sin offering and the guilt offering are contingent upon whether or not people do bad things. So the sin offering is if a sin is either voluntary or becomes known. The animal blood is sprinkled. It's kippured. It covers things. This is atonement language. Blood is sprinkled as a barrier between God and the person who has become unclean by sinning, so that they don't die when God shows up. And they make reparations and they are brought back into cleanness. So it's a recognition that they have done something that separates them from God, makes them unclean, makes them so they cannot be in the presence of God. Blood is sprinkled in order to create this barrier and to purify, and then they're brought back into right relationship with God before they can enter back into the tabernacle, or even near the tabernacle or things like that. You think of Leviticus as kind of these concentric circles of how close you can get to God. And then it's burnt. The guilt offering is if you swear, if you use the Lord's name in vain or use any filthy language, or generally for any kind of uncleanness, even if it's not like sinful, it's just some kind of uncleanness, some kind of ritual impurity that keeps you from being, from offering sacrifices. Here's what the guilt offering is. You do a sin offering, and then you do an ascension or tribute offering. So you do the thing that brings you back into right relationship, and then you do the reason for that, which is this ascension offering, this ascending up the mountain of the Lord to be with God. That's what a guilt offering is. So those are your 5 types of sacrifices. The ascension offering, the tribute offering, and the peace offering. So go up with God, maintain that relationship with God, and eat with God. And then the sin offering, the guilt offering are like, get you back into this system when you leave it. That's what's going on there. All right. Who does the sacrifices? Priests do the sacrifices. Here's how they're ordained. I'm going to describe this. Basically, this is the rites of initiation into the Orthodox Church. The priests are baptized, chrismated, they receive the Eucharist, and then they live the Christian life. So here's how this works. They're washed. And then they are they have all the clothing is put on them. Just like we get washed and we have like the white robe and stuff like that where we do with the baptism, they're clothed in Christ. All of you who have been baptized in Christ have put on Christ. That's talking about priestly ordination. They wear a tunic, belt, robe, ephod, woven band, breastplate, the Urim and Thummim, the turban, and the golden crown. So, fun stuff like that. I'm not going to go into the symbolism of any of those. You should watch the second Exodus episode. Then oil is poured onto the altar. Oil is poured onto the utensils the priest will use in his sacrifice, and then oil is poured all over the tabernacle, and then oil is poured onto the priest. Just like in chrismation, where oil is put all over the different parts of the person, because we are the temple of God. We are the altar, the utensils, the tabernacle, and the priest in our chrismation. And so it's put all over places. It's a greasy process making priests in the Old Testament. And then, like the Eucharist, they make a sin offering just in case they had done anything at all that was wrong. That brings them back into right relationship. And then they make an ascension offering, a tribute offering, and a peace offering. They do the three things. They also have blood anointed onto their right earlobe, their right thumb, and their right big toe, so that they would be a hearer, a doer, and a spreader of, I'm going to say, the gospel. That comes later in human history, but effectively, they are a spreader of God's word. And then they eat. They have the communal meal with the God. So, questions about any of that priestly ordination bit before I get into the back half of their ordination? That all happens in one day. And then there's a process. Okay, then the priests, these new priests, live in the tabernacle for 7 days. They never leave the tabernacle for 7 days. This is an ancient Christian tradition of when we would baptize, chrismate, and give Eucharist to people for the first time, that they would just live in the church for 7 days and never leave it. I don't know whose boss would agree to that if they asked. I'd be really cool. I'd be down for it if we wanted to do it. I just don't think it's going to be super practical. It's not like everyone in the community is in on this, so that's helpful. We do that with monks traditionally. When a monk is tonsured, they just live in the nave of the monastery for the next 7 days. They don't leave it. They're just there all the time. They live in there for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, which, again, if that doesn't sound familiar, the priests and the elders give, you guessed it, a sin offering, just in case anything bad happened. And then an ascension, a tribute, and a peace offering. The priests bless all the people. And then the Lord comes down into the tabernacle and appears in fire. And the priests minister. They do the thing they're supposed to do. They do all they're doing the sacrifices, they're doing the stuff. They are now on the top of Mount Sinai. They're ritually participating in the top of Mount Sinai. Now, the first time this happens, it's a bummer. Because there's 5 priests made. You have Aaron and his 4 sons. And when the Lord appears in fire, the first time at the 8th day of the ordination of these priests, 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, die. Because when God comes down, it says that they burnt strange fire before the Lord, which refers to the kind of incense they're using. So God Most High in the Old Testament required a specific recipe of incense because all the different gods had their own little recipe for incense and stuff like that. And so the Israelites are not allowed to use the incense that's associated with any of the Canaanite gods. It also means they can't get incense from any Canaanites. It's not, you can't go to your neighbor's house and borrow a cup of incense because it's going to be the wrong kind or something like that. So it keeps them divided while they get purified so that later they can ascend. That's part of the dividing, is the Old Testament separates them from everyone else. Nadab and Abihu, apparently, when the fire comes down, apparently instead of just being in the fire, they run over and grab not the giant pile of incense that they've all made of the Christmas. Apparently, they walk right past that pile of incense to their own secret stash of pagan god incense and offer that. And the idea being, here's what incense does. Incense atones. It kippurs, it covers. So, whenever we really do the incense, you can tell because you can't see anything because it's all smoke. That's what it is. It is a protective barrier. One of its jobs is to be a protective barrier between the people and God. It is something between them so that if they're not pure, they're not destroyed. And so that's one of the things incense does. It's also, it drives out evil spirits because it has been sanctified to the Lord. And so using incense drives out spirits. It goes up in smoke. It's like an ascension offering in and of itself. It's like a shadow of the ascension offering, things like that. What Nadab and Abihu are doing is that God comes down and they are scared of God and they want to be protected from God. So they go and get pagan incense and they basically are asking demons to protect them from God. It doesn't work and they die immediately in flames. And Aaron is just standing there watching, apparently. And that's when Moses walks up to Aaron and says, all right, you've got to get their bodies out of the tabernacle. We can't really have dead bodies in here. And Aaron's like, I just watched my sons die. And Moses is like, yeah, we're not playing around, Aaron. I don't know what to tell you. It's a very intense moment. They also then are told that the priests will not be drinking wine when they're on duty. Partly because wine is the consummation, and this is not the final sacrifice. This is not the ultimate sacrifice. But also, we are told right after the whole Nadab and Abihu thing that when the priests are in the tabernacle, they need to be making good decisions. They will have no wine with them. And that's the first time priests were ordained in the Old Testament. And you started with 5 and you end up having 3. And the big thing to pull from this not only is that every Orthodox Christian is a priest in the sense of we have a ministerial priesthood that's special, but all of us are priests. We are all baptized, chrismated, and receive the Eucharist. We eat the sacrifices. We make the sacrifice. These sorts of things. Creativity and worship, not a thing. Not a thing that God approves of. Bringing in strange incense or doing things differently than how God has asked them to be done is not an acceptable way to worship God and can result in bad things happening. All right. Then, now that you have the sacrifices, now that you have the priests to offer the sacrifices, we got to figure out what to do with getting the people close to God. Because it's not just the priest that God wants to save. He wants to save all of the people. But we just got a really big lesson on what happens if you get into the presence of God and you're not prepared for it. We call this being clean or unclean. Clean means you are ritually able to be in the presence of God. Unclean means you are not ritually able to be in the presence of God. Here's the things that can make you unclean. I'm just going to list them, and I'm not going to talk about what to do about them. You can read the book of Leviticus if you want to figure out how to deal with all these problems. Here's the things that make things unclean. Eating certain animals. Typically, these are animals of mixed origin, is how they're thought of. You can think back to the Nephilim. They're a mixture of demon and human, is kind of how they're thought of. That's what makes them unclean spirits. The whole point of the people of God at this point is to separate them from the other nations, because the other nations are worshiping demons. And so every single thing they eat carries with it the message of don't mix. It is also why in the New Covenant, all the food is made clean. Because the whole point of the New Covenant is we're ready now. We did the dividing. We did the washing. And now we're going to do the bringing it back together to bring the Gentiles into the people of God. That's why the food is clean now. That's why it wasn't clean then. We were just at different parts of the sacrificial steps. They can't touch dead things. They also can't touch things that crawl on their bellies on the ground. Welcome to Genesis language. They have to try and stay in the Garden of Eden, in a place where there was no death and where the serpent was the number one enemy. Giving birth makes you ritually unclean because it involves blood being outside of a human. Leprosy, which really, yeah, I've got time. When you hear the word leprosy in the Old Testament, probably don't think of the modern disease that we call leprosy. The modern disease that we call leprosy is named after leprosy in the Bible. They're probably not the same thing. They're almost certainly not the same thing. It might be a form of it, but in the Old Testament, leprosy is such a broad term that it's not just that disease. It refers to anything that is a corruptive force. It is causing something to break down and corrupt. Like mold in the walls of a house is called leprosy in the Old Testament. So corruption is the word I'm going to use for this little bit here. Corruption, any kind of corruption. So a disease of the human body that is corrupting the human body makes them ritually unclean. A disease in your house, a disease in the land, anything that's causing it to be corrupted, to fall apart, you can think of it as a human being is supposed to be alive, but if part of them is dead, now they are both alive and dead, and that's a mix. That's a mixture thing. That's kind of how this ties into uncleanness. Not just being like, this is a bad thing happening to this person, but why does it cause ritual uncleanness? Is because it's this mixture of life and death. And then any kind of bodily discharge where any kind of bodily fluid that is supposed to stay inside of the body gets outside of the body. That also causes ritual uncleanness. All of these have ways to deal with them. They all involve a sin offering and an ascension offering, among other things. So, uncleanness. And so what it's being established in Leviticus, the whole point is trying to get people close to God and trying to get people prepared so that they can be close to God. So it's identifying the kind. Oh, also sinning also makes you unclean. That's also worth bringing up. Sinning makes you unclean. That's what we get to into the holiness code. So anything that makes you a non-perfect human, and I'm going to use that term so carefully, let this be what it is, despite some of the language probably being troubling to our modern ears and minds. Anything that makes you we'll say blemished human causes this uncleanness. And the idea being is that God is trying to teach the people what he is like, and that the things that can be close to him have to be like him. And he is pure and clean and perfect and has no blemish, all those things. And so the high priest has to be ultra perfect, and the priests have to be ultra perfect, but there's not quite as much pressure on them. And the rest of the Levites have to be it's different standards of differentness. Betterness, because sin and righteousness is part of this, but also just differentness. The priests have to eat differently than the normal Israelites do. And it's just these different kind of layers of purity approaching God. The ultimate idea that is put into beautiful terms by Joel is, I will pour out my spirit on all people. That's referring to that priestly ordination where the spirit comes down and fills the tabernacle while the priests are in it. The idea is that eventually all humans will be in that high position brought to God. We're not there yet. And so we've got this big system of how to teach people that God is different from all these other gods. He's not like them. He is something very fundamentally different than they are. Okay. All of this leading up to the one chapter on the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement is a high festival. It is the most important act that Israel is doing. And it's not the point. And I can't stress enough that atonement is not the end goal. Atonement is the most important means to the end, which is communion with God. Here's how the Day of Atonement works. The priest has to put on special linen clothing and start by doing a sin offering just for himself to get him totally clean. Then you take 2 goats. And he takes the Urim and the Thummim, which are these 2 like sticks kind of thing that the high priest has, and he uses them to determine the will of God. And he casts lots, and God picks one of the goats. That goat will be offered as a sin offering for the people, and that's called the goat for the Lord. And then you have the huge cloud of incense. The priest, and it tells you how much incense it is. And anyone who's ever been in the altar and you think how much incense, it's a little spoonful of incense on the coals at a time. The high priest takes a handful of incense and puts it on the coals and incenses, and he steps into the Holy of Holies for the one time ever per year that he steps into the Holy of Holies, where the Lord is going to appear. That's what the Day of Atonement is. It's the day of the Lord, the day that the Lord will appear. Jesus just comes down to commune with the people of Israel in the Holy of Holies on the Ark of the Covenant. And so this is why everything has to be hyper clean on that day, because otherwise you'll get Sodom and Gomorrah instead of the mountain of the Lord. So the priest is fully clean, sin offering made, special clothing that is only being worn at this time. A goat is brought in, the goat that the Lord chooses, unblemished, 1-year-old male, all the stuff, offered as a sin offering. And there's the cloud of incense. And the blood then is taken and it is wiped onto the altar and sprinkled onto the Ark of the Covenant, and it covers everything. This is where the Kippur, the atonement, the covering part of this day comes from. It's a day where you cover everything with a protective barrier to drive out evil spirits and to protect it from God's holiness. And then the huge cloud of incense is to be between the high priest and God when he's in the Holy of Holies so that he doesn't die. And then the most important sentence of this whole thing is, and then when the atonement is done, meaning all of the stuff that happens next is not atonement, and I'm looking at all of our Protestant brothers, then you go to the second goat. This is the goat for Azazel. Azazel is the demon who is identified in Enochic literature as the one who is responsible for sin. He is the demon of sin. If you go back to Genesis 4 and you see God's talking to Cain, he says, sin is waiting for you. This is Azazel. This is a specific demonic being, Azazel, who is trying to seduce Cain into murder. This is where they put their hands on the goat and transfer the sins to the goat. All the sins of Israel are put onto the goat, and the goat is taken outside of the camp, and the goat is not sacrificed. Because you can't sacrifice this now blemished goat. It's brought out into the desert. It is taken to Azazel, who is a demon who lives out in the desert, and is taken out there to just die. Then the priest washes, and then this part stuck out to me. He then takes off the special linen garments he was wrapped in, neatly folds them, and leaves them in the tabernacle, and then walks out. And so if that immediately made you think of Jesus' resurrection, good, you figured it out. This is the passion of Christ. Christ is both goats. Is a great sentence you didn't know you were going to hear tonight, but Christ is both goats. He is the goat for the Lord, whose blood is sprinkled everywhere to protect the people as God manifests himself. And he's also the goat that takes on the sins, is taken out of the camp, and dies. And that's and it's important to remember that the first half of that is the atonement. The goat dying in the wilderness is not the atonement. That's really important to remember when you're talking to people about Christ's atonement. It's not the dying that does the atonement. It's the sprinkling of blood, and that you can almost think it's the passion before that does it. Now, also his blood coming off of the cross is also worse, but like it's not the transfer of sin and the dying that's the atonement. The transfer of sin and the dying is a thing that is taken care of right alongside the stuff that's doing the atonement. All right. And then when Christ is resurrected, the high priest Christ, who has offered himself as a sacrifice, what does he do when he's all done? He takes off the linen wraps, he folds them up neatly, he leaves them in, and then he walks out. And that's the resurrection. That's why we make such a big deal about the linen cloths being left behind in the tomb. That means it's done. The Day of Atonement ritual has been performed fully and completely. And then they offer an ascension offering, because again, the whole point of the atonement is not the atonement. The whole point of it is ascending to God. And so an ascension offering, this is why we make a big deal of the ascension, because that's the lamb that is now ascending up to God and taking our human nature up with him. That's why Leviticus is really cool. And I really like the book of Leviticus. It's just really hard to wrap your mind around it unless, like me, you were able to do a lot of research and have really smart people tell you all of these things beforehand while you prepare for it. All right. Then we get to the Holiness Code, and I'm going to cover this in like 2 minutes. And we are now going to cover half of the book of Leviticus in 2 minutes. You have rules for the people of Israel, followed by rules for the priests of Israel, followed by rules for the land, the property, and the foreigners. And they followed the same kind of schema. You have rules that I'm going to call rules about life, rules about communion, blessings, curses. And it goes, life of Israel, communion of Israel, blessings of Israel, curses of Israel, life of the priest, communion of priest, blessings of priest, curses of priest, it goes like that. So Israelites don't eat blood, and they don't kill, and they don't eat animals that were killed in the wilderness, because in the blood is the life of the animal. Israel has to have a great respect for life. Communion among the Israelites. This is all the marriage laws. So, marriage laws. They are specifically told, don't be like the nations, don't be like demons. Don't commune with demons, commune with God, and the people of God are the image of God. And that's why marriage among the Israelites, totally good. Marriage outside of Israel has some issues. Blessings, love God, love neighbor. Reiterate, don't be like the nations, otherwise curses, death. For the priests, their way of dealing with life, this is all the offerings. This is a rehash of how to do all the offerings correctly, which involve blood, and all of the offerings are made for the life of the people. They're made for the life of the world, for the life of the people. For communion, you get a calendar, which is my favorite form of communion. Dates. They're told about the Sabbath. They're told about Pascha, Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Atonement, which we talked about, and the Feast of Tabernacles. 2 of them happen in the first month-ish, and the rest of them happen in the 7th month. Briefly, the Sabbath is every Saturday. You're not slaves anymore. The Pascha, this is you're really not slaves anymore. The Feast of Pentecost, how much can I emphasize that you're not slaves anymore? Pentecost is the first fruits. Slaves labor and don't profit. Israel labors, but Israel profits. They get the first fruits. But then they give the first fruits to God in a tribute offering. That's what the Feast of Pentecost is all about. It completes Pascha. Pascha is the you're not slaves anymore. Pentecost is this is the result of not being slaves anymore. You have communion with God, and you partake of the fruit of your labors. Then, way later, 7 months later, you get the Feast of Trumpets. It's the new year. It's the first day of the 7th month. And if that sounds a lot like the first day of September, if you know Latin, and September used to be the 7th month, you'd be like, oh, the Orthodox New Year starts on September 1st. That's not a coincidence. It's the Feast of Trumpets because they blow trumpets. And then there's angels that are in charge of the sound that trumpets make, which is one of my favorite jobs of angels. You learn about in the Old Testament. Angels who take care of just the sound, not the trumpets, just the sound they make. 10 days later, you get the Day of Atonement. And 5 days later, you get the Feast of Tabernacles, where everyone has to move out of their house and live in a tent. To remember that you're sojourners on earth. And where does God live? In the tabernacle. What's the tabernacle? It's a giant tent. You're supposed to live like God. That's the idea of the Feast of Tabernacles. Then, how to take care of the tabernacle, and the penalty for not doing these things is death. Then, laws for the land and for property. The land gets a Sabbath every 7 years. Every 7 years, you don't plant anything. You just let the land rest. Because not only are you not slaves, you're also not slave drivers. And so God, just like with the manna, God will make the 6th year hyper prosperous so that you can live through an entire year of no agriculture, which is an insane thing to do in the ancient world. Like, what a wild witness to trusting in God, that as an entire country, you don't plant crops for a whole year. Every 7 years. That's, in a world where even if the crops just aren't very good, you're probably going to lose people in your family from starvation. To purposefully plant nothing and to just rely on God said he would make the food last. Wild thing to do. This is probably the most insane thing they're doing from a worldly perspective. Every 50 years, you have a Jubilee year where anything that any like housing or slaves or anything like that, this kind of durable property is all given back. You only buy things for up to 50 years for real estate and people. Then you have to give them all back at the end of those 50 years. Even if you buy them if you buy them in the 49th year, then you give them back the next year. Also, prices are adjusted depending on how close you are to the next Jubilee. And this is because everyone's a sojourner. No one's property on earth is permanent over anything. That's what God is trying to tell them about. Communion stuff. People are also part of this. You can't own people for more than 50 years. Also, you can't treat them like the slaves of the other nations. They actually, basically, when an Israelite has a slave, that slave is to be treated as a member of the family. Period. Not as a slave. Not as property. They are a member of the family who works for you. And they are released at the Jubilee. You are specifically not allowed to overwork them. And if anyone is poor, even if they're not a slave, if anyone is poor, the Israelites are commanded to give them anything they need, and that person does not accrue any debt. You can never accrue debt for receiving as a gift anything that you need to survive in Israel. And then the blessings. It's just all the promises of Abraham, again, in long form. The curses. It's the opposite of all the promises of Abraham in long form. And then you get that weird last chapter where they're like, if you make a promise that you didn't have to make, but then you find out later that you can't fulfill that promise, here's how you get out of that. And no one knows what to do with that last chapter. I'm glossing over it. In our last 30 seconds, any questions about the book of Leviticus? No. It's a book about how to get to heaven, who does the work to do there, how to become that kind of a person, the way God accomplishes it, and then how your life needs to look because of this. It's a great, but it's kind of like Catechesis, the book, in some sense. It's just really hard to read if you're like an American nowadays, because like we don't live a life that looks a lot like this typically. But that's Leviticus. Now Leviticus isn't as hard to read because now you're like, I know why we're talking about the sacrifices. okay, I can keep my eye on the prize of what might be important here and what might not be so important. So, cool.
Do you know if Orthodox Jews still do these things?
They do some of them.
Yeah.
They do what they can. So they don't eat blood. They don't shave like the side of their head. There's like all these different things. They don't offer sacrifices because there's no temple. There's no tabernacle.
Jubilee.
What?
About Jubilee.
They don't. If they live in the land of Israel, then they should be following the Jubilee. If they don't live in the land, so I could talk about this a lot more. There's a large subsection of rabbinic Judaism is the rabbis basically trying to figure out which laws can and can't be followed. Because again, if you don't follow the laws that you have to follow, that's it. You're cut off from the people of God. So this is like a big issue for them is, well, God doesn't require us to follow a law that you can't do. That's why like average person does not have to do what the priests do. They're not a priest. They can break those laws in that sense. So a big part of rabbinic Judaism is what laws apply and which laws only apply if you're in the Holy Land and which laws don't apply if you're outside. Like there's a lot of that. And I am not qualified to make any statements about that. But did I read a lot of Wikipedia about it? Yes. I, in fact, did read a lot of Wikipedia about the Talmuds and how they're dealing with 613 commandments, but you can't follow all of them, and there's all so. Yes, an entire planned period went into just Wikipedia articles on that exact question, and I learned that I have no idea.